Hello, everyone. This is Curt, Francis, and Martin for the Natural Law Institute.
Sorry, wait 1 sec. There's something wrong here. All right, go ahead.
3, 2, 1 again, or no?
Just go ahead.
Hello, everyone. This is Curt, Francis, and Martin from the Natural Law Institute. This is Friday, December 13th, 2024, which is the Templars Remembrance Day, because that's the cause of the Friday the 13th custom. This is our again our office hours where we answer questions. Questions are submitted by a form that Francis posts in the video underneath the video, and then I guess we don't have to filter them anymore because the questions are so good.
They have been self-filtering.
They've been self-filtering, and then Martin goes through and answers them. Martin's pretty much always right. He leaves a few subjects for me because he's, I don't know, not interested or something. And then I add color and context, which basically means I say a lot more words. But anyway, these turn out to be pretty good videos, and I guess we're in the process of trying to break them up. I've done some of them. I've tested some of them. They end up being 20-minute little 10 or 20-minute single subject videos where we answer quite a few questions, because I was surprised how many questions we've answered. It's hundreds.
Oh yeah,
Right.
6 or 7. And we've been going at this for a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Probably gonna come up in 2 years in a few months. Then every time we answer 5 or 6 questions, and they add up.
Yep. It's amazing. And then we'll actually probably group them into playlists of similar things, because like I know like there's an art one today, and we have I've answered quite a few pieces on art I know myself. Martin has a huge number on basically the right. But we are all over the place, so it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting to put together the sort of knowledge base of videos. We're getting to the point where the scope of content we have can't be organized on YouTube because they don't give us enough space to categorize our work. We actually would need about 5 more rows of content on YouTube to be able to keep everything organized and accessible. So
What do you mean, the playlist or the SEO search terms or what?
they only load you so many rows, right?
On the
On,
email on the channel page.
right on the channel page.
Ah, yes.
And so I'm like, in order to keep things so that they're not confusing, you have to put them in these rows or in these blocks within rows. But if you don't, and then you have sort of two rows that you sort of need to have, and so that leaves you like 8 more. Well, for us, that's just not enough to make it so that our content is both. It's like the chapter introduction, the list of chapters in the beginning of a book.
Mm-hmm.
Those chapters tell you a lot about the book. I would like our work to be presented in that sort of form, so that you would see the scope of the work implied from the structure of it itself. And YouTube is just not giving us. I wish we bribe somebody at YouTube to let us have a few more rows. Anyway, so how this works is Francis usually reads the question. Mark. I got Brad, Brandon, and Martin. So the N sound and the brr sound, and I just sort of, for some reason, I have to mix these up with Freudian slips all the time. So Martin reads his answer, and then I add my color. So hopefully we'll answer some bunch of questions people want to know the answers to. I'm sorry about my voice. I just rolled out of bed because I thought I had this week off, and Francis was his usual managerial disciplinarian, and surprised me that we had to be on this morning.
Just for this month, the holiday encores.
All right, so do your thing, Francis.
All right, let's start with question 1. And we saved this from last week. How do we evaluate the work of Van Gogh?
That's not. It's easy to evaluate Van Gogh if you know what's going on in the arts in the 1800s. And what's going on in the arts in the 1800s are two basic factors. One is the advent of photography, basically making representationalism, in other words, realism, economically unviable in art, where realism had been there's portraits and that kind of thing, had been the way you earned your living so that you could make your other pieces, your landscapes and your other decorative pieces. So the economy of art was under collapse in response to the advent of photography. So what did artists do? The first thing they did was Impressionism. And so Impressionism is best illustrated by, I don't know, Monet is probably the best answer, and his water lilies. And so what he's done is just as we can play with Photoshop today to use filters and processing to amplify colors and contrasts, that's the first thing that they did, right, was work with color and texture and image to do what photography couldn't. So it was more like an exaggeration or an expression of the human aspects that were present in the world that were not present in photography. This continued once that was explored, with new people coming up with new ideas, of which Van Gogh is one, which was to take this sensory experience and expand it into the emotional experience. So you have Van Gogh bringing in not only impressionistic aspects of his painting, not only in the color choices and contrasts, but in the thickness of the brush stroke, for example. I'm particularly thinking of his self-portrait. And so overloading the brush technique itself, and secondly, overloading the emotion in it. I'm trying to think of an example. Let me see if I can find one real quick here. I keep going to the scream, and that's not what I want to use as it. Starry Night's a good one. So the Starry Night is a great example. So if you think of it as a technological evolution of art from the traditional realism and idealism and romanticism, right, which is the posturing humans on luxurious Roman style, whatever, half naked in the draping clothes or whatever. This is a demonstration of the artist's technical competency, right? So that's what that's really showing, plus the high art content of cultural tradition being portrayed, plus the use of these scale paintings in particular as decoration for architectural spaces. That's sort of where these things are working. Then you get into where you see the Dutch, right? The Dutch masters, and that comes about because there's enough wealth in the world that not only churches and the very wealthy like the nobility, can afford to sponsor art. But at this point, you're seeing with the Dutch, you're starting to see the rise of commercial Europe. It's basically the end result of the formation of the Hansa earlier, and you're seeing the commercial. So now you have a middle class wanting paintings, right? So you develop the Dutch master suite of people, and at the same time you develop prints, which make it even available to more people, because instead of one monumental painting, which had been history's tradition, or you got many upper middle class paintings, and you even got middle class prints and etchings. And so you made art available to more people as a status symbol, because you reduced the cost of producing these particular works. So then a few, that's the 14 to 1600s, whatever. Then you get along to the advent of technology and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and you have the same process happen, which is this democratization or this mass production of art to fulfill the status demands of emerging populations. The difference was that photography punched a hole in representationalism, and so you got a series of innovations in production that were frankly cheaper to produce, obviously, in most cases, but increase in production of paintings that were innovations that photography couldn't compete with. And this became the novelty. So, as we know, in most markets, for attention, for status, you're looking for novelties. This is why the history of art is the study of works that represent the optimum examples of the whatever novelty had been invented in the time and place. So realistically, Van Gogh is a pretty rational expression of the market of his time, where people are trying to get attention by doing, well, okay, well, we did photography, is put a hole in some of our stuff. We did impressionism, and now we're into sorry, it's escaping me. Um, uh, 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 a second. Sorry, I've got too many notes here. So what's happened is that you've got into this abstract expressionism and everything that follows, and it's just basically appealing. It's sort of the opposite, right? We started out with this religious art that's appealing to high-mindedness and cultural dominance, because that's who's producing it, the nobility and the church, and then we end up with personal expression by the time we get to Van Gogh, which is almost recreating imaginary. And after that, you get the sequence of movements like person declining staircase, which is this cubist stuff. And so it's basically the exploration of what isn't realism by the exploration of what kind of art can we produce that appeals to human psychology, that is not represented by realism, but is more represented by the cognitive and emotional and spiritual process. So if I say that argument, it's not so much about Van Gogh himself, but it's about the context in which he was working, and that he is representative of this emotional state. And in particular, probably I should mention that the vast change from 1812 to 1912, that 100 years, the world changed more than it had in the past 2000. And so, you know, he's in that period, and people are discovering a sense of angst because of that change. And his work, because he's mentally ill, is basically incorporates the angst of that feeling of the period. So when you evaluate art, I think the problem most people have isn't that they can't tell good art from bad, because most people can, is that you can't tell the context of the art, the meaning in the art, because of its context, which requires a basic knowledge of history and the history of art to appreciate it, what it is. Just like very few people can look at fashion in the day and at the moment, or music, which is another kind of fashion right now. It's hard to look at it and say, well, uh, evaluate it other than how I feel about it, because you don't understand what's going on in the warp and weave and cut technologies available to the clothing industry, or you don't understand the economics of the clothing industry. I went on a rant a couple of weeks ago, I'm sure on this forum. I don't know. I went on so many. I talked about it so many places. I assume I did it here. Is that you can't buy good men's clothes in America anymore, except from Ralph Lauren and LL Bean and maybe one other, because you can't buy this quality of fabric, because the price now wouldn't be for a shirt, would be universally $100 to $130, and so they can't, and that's because so many factories went out of business during the COVID experiment, that only the people who could mass produce goods for sale under COVID, the conditions of COVID, could remain in business. So unless you're willing to pay $130 for a shirt, I mean, these used to be 69 or 70, and you can't buy them anymore, which is why I love them. But you can't buy them anymore. And you can buy them from Polo Ralph Lauren, or you can buy them from LL Bean, but they're going to be up in that upper price bracket. They're not going to be in the $20 where most men would like it to be, in the $50 to $60, which is where a good shirt should be, or the $90, which is where a great shirt would be, but it's now in the 110 plus, which used to be the domain of like some of the designers I have, where it has a different colored thread for here, and embossing there, special stuff in here. It's caught right. It has a fabric that is ridiculously expensive to produce. You
Is it
can't.
because the production cost or because of raw material?
It's the production costs.
Okay.
The impact of COVID. It's like, I don't know how to say it. Like, I could see the impact. I could see the impact on computers coming, right? Or I could see that happen on laptops and desktops. I saw that coming and what would happen there, and that was easy predicting. You could see that on store shelves, and so you could see that there would be a collapse of the technology megastores and whatever, right? But the Fry's electronics
Mm-hmm.
experiment, you could see that was going to go away. You have to and that's within our living experience. But I don't think we saw what happened to the clothing industry.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was mostly invisible because we just didn't look at it. And we have to look at the same thing happening to art throughout the centuries. Is an artist needs to make a fucking living,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you're a Da Vinci, you basically work in a studio for other people producing industrial levels of art for the church and the nobility, and then you try to work your way up until you can get actually the commissions yourself, and then get your own studio, which is exactly how creative works in marketing and advertising today. You basically work for some firm until you capture a couple of accounts, and then you go found your own firm, and then you build it up. But what's happened to that business? Well, the internet's killed a lot of that business, and so those agencies are suffering and collapsing. So if the art is no different from any other industry, if you look at it not as the art world and the left want you to look at it, like is spontaneous emotional flourishing, but as an emotional, technological system of production
Hmm.
for selling symbols of status to people desirous of it. And if you look at art from that perspective, it's just
Yeah,
economics,
it's. I
which
was gonna say it just boils down to economics and
economics,
technology,
which
and with
I got to tell you, being a 20 year old art student at one of the few real theoretical art schools did not fucking make me popular. It was the opposite. Nobody could argue against me, but they did not like what I was saying.
you. So your comment here made me think with all these AI video imaging agents, what effect that will have on the remaining artists.
It has.
That they have to innovate in ways that AI simply can't. I mean, people laugh about, I mean, myself especially, about the uncanny valley that that the AI agents generates. You know, you have an extra thumb or some non such, but it's coming. I mean, it's just going to be a matter of time before it gets to a point I can't even tell the difference between a real photograph and that of an AI generated photograph.
Okay, so here's a great example right now, presently, right? So um, they can't do more than like a minute yet of consistency, right?
Hmm.
And you once you see a video of more than a few seconds, you can see it because there's no the temporal consistency in these things is more across a few frames than it across.
Hmm. Yeah.
All right. And so now they're working on making models and stuff. So it'll evolve the way it is. But so there's a channel or a theme. I don't know if I think it's a channel that basically looks at hot women in world militaries, right?
Hmm.
Like the American Air Force has some fucking beauty pageant, well, quality women in it, right? Now, which is the opposite. So you'll say, well, how come you never seen ugly women with good looking men? I'm like, you haven't obviously been to a military base where all these really buff, fit, rough looking guys who are highly disciplined and clean cut and the whole thing have these fucking trailer park wives that are hideous, right?
Yes.
All right. So you haven't seen that side of it, but so they make these videos of these women, sponsoring these women, and I know it's a recruiting technique. It doesn't really matter. I'm just using parallel. And then someone's come along and used the AI to create um, videos of hot women in every country in the proper military uniforms. Instead, of course, they're only 1, 2, 3, they're like 4 seconds long, right?
Hmm.
Something like that. They're just long enough to not have the AI be that obvious, right? And I'm like, yeah, exactly. This is the future. I mean, but what I said back in 2009 to the marketers who, other than Google, who knew the data, and the marketers didn't. They were working on tradition, right? So I'm talking about these marketers, creators, and advertising folks at this big conference center, and I'm doing my pitch with a big fucking screen behind me, the whole thing, and this trying to have all the stage presence. I was telling them that this is going to happen. Not only that this is not that the AI is going to happen, but that the selling the macro dream, the macro uh, status through acquisition of
Hmm.
traditional symbolic goods, right, is over, and you're going to have to sell identities. Right, you're going to have to, if you want to sell one thing, you've got to sell it to these groups of people, right? You've got to pitch it differently to these groups. And the example I gave at the time was how well the PlayStation sales had been doing, which was exactly what I'd been telling Microsoft they needed to do, which is stop categorizing everybody in these little blocks that are identical, but instead put out advertising that appealed to what we would call mini segments, right? don't, right? Because all gamers aren't the same. All all white collar workers aren't the same, or information workers aren't all the same. All developers aren't the same, right? Um, uh, and so if you instead try to appeal to an identity within, in other words, the status within an identity instead of the universal status of the ascendant middle class, you would be able to form a relationship with people. Because back at the time, and I realize Microsoft's reformed since then, which is something you keep reminding me of because I'm so traumatized by the past of it that it's stuck in my head. Um, but because every time Microsoft talked at the time, it made it worse. You know,
Hmm.
it's better off doing no advertising than any, because it was actually harmful because the way they were thinking about their information worker, developer, gamer, etc., than the others were, and so it was actually harmful. So if we can just, the problem is we're pretty sophisticated guys. Can you go to the ordinary person and say, well, to evaluate art and to understand Van Gogh, it's basically understanding the economics of the time, which is a mixture of the technologies for expression available, like knowing how to do three dimensionals, right? Three dimensional perspective, how to mix color and contrast, how light works, which they knew at this time because we already had prisms. So you could say, okay, well, I got to know what those things are available for emotional expression, and as well as the economy of producing it and who's selling it, because it's basically a status good. Well, it's a luxury good. Anyway, so if you understand that, then all of art history is actually pretty explicable. And then when you do art history worldwide, you see that the same effect is happening in different cultures at different levels of development. And the only thing that really differs is the metaphysical value judgments between the cultures that end up in their high art. Once that metaphysics is in your high art, like Japanese harmony, Chinese aesthetic harmony, which is is very is somewhat different, um, and or Hindu, hyper decoration and mythicism, or or Egyptian imperialism. Right? And once you understand these, or Muslim iconography, so to speak, you start to see these as just, okay, there's this group strategy, there's a level of technological development in the construction and whatever, and there's a level of technological development in the meaning, and that's it. That's all there is, and it's a pretty simple algorithm to judge art by. But without that context, sort of like everything else we do, without knowing the first principles across the spectrum, and being able to understand how everything's related to everything else, the world seems chaotic. But if you understand what we do, the world isn't chaotic. It's actually pretty understandable. Well, the same thing applies to art, and the same thing applies to economies, and the same thing applies to everything else. Okay, that's my rant. That was pretty good, though. I'm pretty impressed with that. I'm pretty happy with that one.
Hmm. I vaguely remember like maybe I asked this question before and we answered it before. But I can see the consistent theme coming through, right? It's really, it's not so much about the appreciation of the artist and so on. All of these are driven, the behavior of artists are also driven by economic um, undercurrents. I think we're going to see art, even digital art, especially photography, changing now that AI is on the scene.
Yeah, I spent a couple of hours. I don't know if I talked to you about this or not yesterday, but I spent a couple of hours with a guy who runs a studio locally,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he's probably your age,
Mm-hmm.
and he's described how hard it was to break even last year compared to all the years before.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I'm not gonna say the obvious, which is get fucking used to it, right? But you better get used to it. I think there's gonna be a realism counter revolution against it at some point. You know that's gonna happen because the generated stuff is novel, right? And it helps the bottom. In other words, people who couldn't afford to hire an artist, that's it definitely makes them able to create book covers or write
Hmm.
on work that allows them to present a higher quality of investment than they could afford through with human labor, right? But normally, humans, because these systems are algorithmic, humans can outcreate a machine, right? Be, uh, because this individual subtlety of the individual's perception of the world varies, where the AI develops a coherent strategy of understanding the world, right? And it can be told to imitate other things. But I think what we'll see is, because we already see this in some places, it's like when Martin beats on me for using the AI to write a section better than I've written it myself, right? Um, um, there's a group of people who will prefer that it will treat computer generated imagery and prose as as not as not authentic.
Hmm.
So we'll probably see that feedback arise. And I'm seeing it already, but
Yep, they can actually tell the difference.
yeah, because well, I mean, uh, if you look at someone like Frank Frazetta,
Hmm.
who is notorious in the community for his quality of affecting fantasy art for a long time, right? It's less consistent than an AI would make,
Less consistent. What do you
right?
mean?
You can see his evolution and his errors and his
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah.
right. And I
It's
think
less perfect
it's less
than what a
perfect.
perfect AI could make.
Correct.
So then as the I guess as the surreal, over the top, perfectly clean digital image generated by AI start to flood the market, we're gonna see artists, even photographers or and sketch artists and whatnot, going the other direction, and showing that their imperfect human side.
Sure. So when you're taught you're classically trained artist, which I am. You learn things like how to draw your sketch,
Mm-hmm.
right, in charcoal, then in pencil, and then you say, okay, I need to shift this around because you're always looking for a triangle somewhere, so you want to move it into this position and move these people around, so you get it about right. And then by various means of drawing a grid and copying it to scale, or using a pantograph, which will do it automatically. It's a little device that will scale your work up for you and
Mm-hmm.
tracing it. Or when in my era, what was available was reasonably priced projectors that
Mm-hmm.
didn't distort. So I would take a drawing and I would project it on a canvas. I would just
Oh.
pencil it in and do the thing. And so, and what I suspect will happen with AIs is that we will use AI to draft, and because AI isn't is determinable, uh,
Deterministic.
right? That you would go in and use that as your basic underpainting and put human expression over the top of it,
Hmm.
which I can see that becoming like the common, because the real hard part of art, believe it's really stupid. The hard part of art is proportion. The way you know somebody's good is that the hands are the proportion. I mean, getting things in relation in space and
Mm-hmm.
keeping them in proportion, that's actually the hard thing to do. I know in my mind when I'm doing it, I have to hold the what I want in my head, and it's sort of tracing on the canvas or the
Mm-hmm.
paper, whatever, what's in my head, right? Whereas when you're not skilled, you have this idea of a mark that needs to be made, and you sort of do it over and over again until you sort of get this thing to refine, right? Whereas if you can see great artists do that. You can see them they'll just do the gesture, and they'll make it pretty much right the first time. In my training was you drew the skeleton of a thing, and then you put the muscles and the skin over the
Yeah.
skeleton, right? And that's how you maintained proportion. But you start out with spine and hips and shoulders
Just
and
simple as lines. Make sure those lines are the right
right
proportions, and then you
proportion.
start filling them out.
There. So I suspect that we'll see something along those lines. And in that sense, maybe we'll get more monumental art because monumental art, for that reason, it's just too fucking expensive. You can't make it anymore because you can't afford to take a year or two on a composition, and you certainly can't get. And this is something you guys will like. When you had the aristocracy for competing for talent for by the decoration they would put in their homes, castles, public spaces, and churches, right? So when you had that happening, when that was nobility, they didn't claim it was their talent they used the market to determine who was the best person. But if you go to some place like fucking Redmond here where we live, right? It's some fucking idiot that has made that decision about the piece of art, right? It's not anybody who knows what they're doing, right? It's somebody who wants status by being able to claim that they're the one that caused that piece of art to be selected, right? And they're worried about all this democratic stuff. They're not worried about is this a demonstration of excellence which we all seek to imitate, which is what the aristocracy was always trying to do. And so you would get this. So back in the day, you would appeal to these people who would sponsor you to decorate these public spaces, basically, and because they're even their homes, right? A manor house has 3 levels to it:
Hmm.
public spaces, the private spaces for the people who live there, and then the servant spaces, right, for who live there and take care of them, right? And so if you see those houses, I mean, there's because there's so much restoration going on, specifically in France, you can actually see how differently these spaces are configured and decorated. I mean, my favorite example is in the upper floors. They split the floor so there were actually 2 floors there, and instead of being a floor that was 15 feet high, it's 2 7-foot floors, right, or smaller, and the servants live in these half
Yeah.
floors, right? And so and then they're not exactly decorated, whatever. I mean, you're not trying to make your servants have a status signaling, just the opposite. God knows they might forget to be humble, right? And yet, if you get down in the public spaces, what did Alora say? My wife said something. I'm tired of looking at ostentation. Like, is it we were? I can't remember where we were. What kind? It might have been England. Just I'm tired of touring ostentation. Um, but at the time, that was a really big deal. So art fulfills that role, and if you understand that, then it
So
is what it
I
is.
guess here's my question. Let's say the the new aristocracy, these Silicon Valley tech bros. And let's pick an example, right? If Elon Musk wants to commission a piece of monumental art, are there still artists capable of that, or has
Absolutely.
they been selected out of the market already?
There are artists who propose public works of that scale.
Hmm.
Very few of which get taken up. There are artists who are capable of it, and they're usually classically trained, and there's very few of them remaining.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
that's the point I was trying to get at.
right. There is still people who can do bronze and bronze casting, but can you get bronze and bronze casting of traditional monumental scale like we see, like Washington and his horse on a pedestal, right? Um, that's getting pretty hard to do. There are
Hmm.
still others that can do it, but it's getting very hard to do. Um, if you see sculptor, there are guys who can do what's called restoration level sculpture, and their work is crazy. It's it's working with stone in any level of precision is a high art and a high craft. It's actually quite challenging to do that. And to do it consistently so that blocks of stone fit together into a composition. It's quite difficult to do that.
Well, not only that, but one bad chisel, you've ruined years of
Yeah,
work.
oh, exactly. I mean, and it's oh God. Yeah. So you do all sorts of techniques, like you make sure that if you're going to work on something that's fragile, you leave stone there supported until it's done, and then you cut away the support structure and remove it. It's sort of like 3D printing,
Yeah,
right? Right. It's the
that's what it
same thing.
reminded me of.
Yes. So what was your question again? I
Oh,
lost.
well, if someone could, someone
Can be doing
rich,
on.
like yeah, do we still have? If someone commits monumental art today, do we still have the human talent to do it?
We have a small cadre of people that can still do it because there are enough people who are so romantically attached to the doing and preserving the craft that they are willing to endure the economic hardship of preserving the craft. There are those people, right? The more interesting question in the outside of the craftsmanship side, is there anyone capable of doing high art anymore?
I thought monumental art equals the high art. Or
Well,
am I confusing
monumental
them?
is the high. Okay, monumental art is the economic expression, right? But what about the meaning and content? In other words, can we produce heroic art any longer in monumental form? And the answer appears to be no. And I don't think unless we are and the current movement of restoration is successful that we'll be able to produce high art. In fact, you can't go to a playhouse that isn't producing trash. In other words, anti-high art isn't producing Marxist sedition. You can't go to a playhouse and see a play that isn't largely producing Marxist
You know,
sedition.
the one high art that I can think that has been preserved is classical music. You still get
Absolutely.
philharmonic orchestras. They still play
Yeah.
Beethoven and nines, just well, maybe not as well as Beethoven would have conducted it, but it's still reasonable. It still sounds like Beethoven and nines. It's
Yeah,
pretty hard to inject Marxism stuff in there.
I'm not even offended. This is an interesting thing. I think it's because it's on stage. Um, it's the same thing in in ballet versus modern dance.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If you see some modern dance, it's just got more forms available in it. In other words, right. And so I'm not. I don't. I'm like. I would. I'm happy to go to a. I mean, I used to member. I mean, when I lived in Seattle, we were um, season ticket holders for the ballet, the symphony, the two playhouses, right? And we held all those things, right? So, but and Seattle's a pretty left wing place. I mean, I would complain about it to the every year when they ask you. I'm like, you have to keep the mix of the classical and the contemporary, or you're basically alienating an audience in order to support the dreams of the cast members and the directors who are obviously part of the movement of the time. So I don't know. I mean, I think you hit on a thing. You can produce high art in classical music and symphonic music. You can produce high art, I think,
Well,
in
my correction, I think I just realized is you can replicate that high art
mm,
in classical music.
mm,
I don't
mm.
know of anyone of Beethoven's caliber of life today that can produce that
Well,
kind of symphonic
okay,
music.
this is a smart statement. Um, Beethoven, in particular, was taking German melodies, traditional
Mm-hmm.
German melodies, like folk melodies, and putting them in symphonic form. I think when I look at someone like Hans Zimmer,
Yeah.
right?
Oh
Um,
yes, that's a good one.
right. So if I look at Hans Zimmer, he is doing things that weren't all that possible before that. You
Well,
couldn't do
because they didn't
certain
have the technique. They didn't
the,
have like
the
computer
technology,
synthesized mixers and all these things. And
but I don't. I see his work as just as. I mean, there's people who are composers today that produce crap, right? It's not bad. It's just commodity music, right? But you do have a few guys. I can't think of the. They're first. When I'm in a context, I can't sometimes shift, so I can't think of Zimmer and the other guys, right?
Like
But
John
there's
Williams, Star
yeah,
Wars.
Williams, and then who's the other one? And in even in computer game music, there's the guy who did the Morrowind theme. What's his name?
Jeremy So.
Yeah, Jeremy Soule. So he started out. Now there's a whole bunch of imitators of him.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Jeremy Soule did that, but that ended up in Game of Thrones, ended up in Westworld, ended up in all these TV introductions
Mm-hmm.
now that have this thematic vision. And so, you look at you look at this, and I'm like, well, there's still innovation happening. Um, I
Just
think
need to
you,
look for them in the right places, and it's
you
all
correct.
market force driven.
It's all market driven. You have to be able to make money at it.
Yeah.
The opposite problem is happening in popular music, is you can't make money at it anymore. So the quality of popular music is declining. Who is that talking about this? Who's the guy who's the head man of Kiss? Gene Simmons. You got to think about it. This guy is really fucking smart. Okay, the fact that he made a band like Kiss to play on the moment to make money,
Mm-hmm.
that's whatever. But as an intellectual, this guy he's no dope, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he's up there, right? And he said, well, it's just the economics of the industry. You can't make money anymore because you can't you because the stuff is easily replicable and distributable, so the artist can't capture revenue for it, and because of that, studios can't invest in artists, right? And so if you get anybody that can make any money, which means they can fill a concert hall, which is where they make their money today, right? Used to be that you made performances in person and made money.
Mm-hmm.
Then we went to you could make money off of radio and records and tapes and CDs, and now we're back. We've exhausted that economic arc because there's really no way to protect music, because the minute
Mm-hmm.
it can reprocessed for the human ear, it can be reprocessed as a free of digital signature. So the end result is that we get
So the end result is we for the last 20, 30 years, we've gone to the digitization cycle into virtual space. The end result is that actually the flooding of the market in virtual space and with AI is now forcing us back into meat space.
I think that's a great way of quickly saying it. Yes, I think there will be a counter revolution that will force us back into meat space. I have a hard time though, just as a guy who writes myself, right, of how much there's a big difference between writing down an idea and making an argument, and writing accessible prose. Does that make sense? All right. And so I find that if you look at the book on logic I wrote without the help of AI, it's definitely my work, but it's not as accessible as the book I've just almost finished on, which is you've helped me with, you guys have helped me with, which is the book on language as a system of measurement. And so when I look at those two, the latter is longer and easier to read, and the former is shorter and harder to read. For me, I'd prefer the former, but if you want people to read your stuff, you want the latter. So I don't have a problem with using the machine for that. I'm kind of weirded out by people who just trying to write books automatically, because that's just going to be the mass
I
producing of
think
bullshit.
that's just lazy. Yeah, this is the part. Maybe this is the part that turns me off the most about AI. Is that you spend all this energy, all this computational power to create a bunch of stuff that that sucks the life out of people.
Yes,
It's so the matrix is already here, and we've created it.
it's the same problem they went through the Industrial Revolution. It's why we got the Luddites, right? Is that this is sucking meaning out of my life,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's sucking the humanism out of life. So I mean, I'm not one of these reactionaries who said we should do anything about that. I think that what will happen is we'll go through the experiment and we'll correct it in some way. But yeah,
So
I'm not a big fan. I was really a fan of the democratization of experience, basically music and art, through And I have, but I, in other words, and I was myself part of the generation that made our lives and our livings and based on the democratization of computing power, right? But today, I'm not sure we're seeing the democratization of computing power, but we are seeing the democratization of the access to information organized in a format for personal consumption. In other words, it's very difficult to go out there and do the work we have done on the convergence of multiple fields. Could I have done that without the internet? No, I would have run out of time. It just wouldn't have been possible to access that many paper and read that many paper printed things. Well, it's the same thing that's happening already in the scientific research doing AIs, is that they're finding interstitial findings. In other words, there's knowledge out there in multiple silos, right? That is that identifies a pattern between the experiment in this silo and the experiment in this one. And so the AI is identifying interstitial relationships that we just can't see because of the simple problem of it. You can only program a mind so fast.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas a computer isn't bound by that limitation. It's hugely fucking expensive, but it doesn't take as much time. And so so what I expect to happen is we will identify a lot of what we call low-hanging fruit in these interstitial spaces with AIs. But most of the problems that I understand that exist today in the sciences, and I mean the fundamental problems. I don't mean, geez, which chemical combination can I use to preserve this molecule through these states? I mean, that's just trial and error shit. But the problem with fundamental issues is we can't afford to do the experiments, right? We can't run a test. And so how is an AI going to do that? How's an AI going to run a test when we can't run tests to figure it out? We don't know the first principles. So I suspect we're going to keep getting these interstitial discoveries. And of course, we'll get computational discoveries. So that's like the protein folding problem, which is the canonical issue, right? That's like really fucking proteins are fucking complicated. It's amazing to me, right? These little goddamn machines are unbelievable. They can do work and do complex work, right? And so, but how do you predict it? Holy fuck. It's impossible. But the machines can do that because they're not working with discrete combination, they're working with heuristic recombination. And so they can identify potentials more that we can't, simply because
it's just a brute force problem, right? Because the chemical compositions, you know the first principles. I mean, it's chemistry at the atomic level, and there's only so many ways that this thing can work, and it's like Deep Blue predicting chess moves. It's brute force.
Yes. Right. And so this is the example I've been using in most of my lifetime, has been Mandelbrot's really simple argument. Look, you couldn't do fractals before because humans can't do it. Right? It's the same thing. What's her name said? What's the German term?
Sabine Hass.
And so she said, well, when she was in college, if you couldn't figure out the integral, you were done. But now you give it to a fucking machine and it figures out the integral for you. Mm-hmm. Right? But you couldn't. That's not that long ago, that you just couldn't fucking figure it out. So this whole compression of the learning cycle, you think of that as the learning that not only the calculation cycle, but the learning cycle, which we think of it as brute forcing. This whole thing is going to yield accelerations for us and innovations for us. But I'm not sure that the limit of those accelerations and innovations, isn't just limited, just like we are, to the.
It's limited by computational reducibility.
Correct.
You cannot predict problems that are computationally irreducible. And I think the key then becomes knowing which problems are computationally reducible versus irreducible.
Correct. Well, and the difference is for heuristic machines, which is what these things are, right? They're more like our brains. So there's computational reducibility, right, which is operational, but there's heuristic reducibility, right? So I think we should discuss that. Is that heuristic machines are working by the vast condensation of probabilities, right?
Hmm.
Right, into categories rather than calculations, right? And so the capacity for these things to produce permutations to explore is probably quite high, from which we can test whether they're computationally reducible. Does that make sense? If we
I
can,
don't, hold on, I don't quite follow that part.
if you can come up with a hypothesis,
Uh-huh.
we can test whether it's computationally or what we would call operationally
Uh-huh.
reducible. Um, And so I think that we've just discussed another issue that is common, and that much of the West succeeded because it used geometry as its model of mathematics.
Right, and there's no way that you can fake geometry. Either
Correct.
your triangles become a triangle, or it's not a triangle.
Right.
Unlike in math, you can have
Right.
weird shit like square root of -1.
Right. So math is a language and geometry is an operation, right?
Hmm.
I mean, that's it. So what are heuristics by comp? They're imaginations, right? So heuristics are imaginations. So you have the constructions, geometry, you have mathematics, which is you have verbal reducibility or linguistic reducibility, and then you have heuristics, which is imaginary reducibility, imaginary. The difference is, hopefully, you can reduce these things to operational reducibility, right? And that's what you know when you're correct, right? That's when you know the difference between a correlation and a causation is when you've got them to operational reducibility, which is, of course, what we try to explain. Does this
Okay,
make sense?
I think
That killed this one.
we killed this one, including the side, what do you call it, the sideways. And we need to pick up the pace, because at this pace we're gonna have to have like what is it, bi-weekly or once,
Oh, yeah, okay, we're
twice a
going to
week sessions
go.
to get through all of them.
Well, I would just say that's a really long, that's an hour-long conversation we just had,
Yes,
right? But I
that we
mean,
just branched out.
yeah, but there's a lot in that hour, right, for
Yes.
people to get.
All right. Question 2. Please explain your view on what caused the Bronze Age collapse.
Fuck. We have to go to one goddamn complex thing to another.
There's a easy solution to this. You can just ask Roger to make a video if he hasn't already.
I don't know if Rudyard would get this right, because I think Rudyard has a Middle Eastern bias. I'm not positive. Maybe I might have to think about this. Okay. So just as we said, to evaluate art, we have to understand the economy, technology of the time in the context of a group evolutionary strategy. To understand the Bronze Age collapse, we have to understand the the climate, ecology, and group strategy of the people at the time. The climate, ecology, and economy and group strategies of the people at the time. And my feeling is we're very good at reduction to first principles, which means causality. And so we are comfortable stating multiple causes, right? Multiple causes as bringing about these changes. And I think that the traditional problem is that the humans want to reduce a cause to a single factor. It's the reason we have a problem with the Bronze Age collapse, and we have a problem with the collapse of Rome, or we have a problem with the spread of the plague, or we have a problem today. We are really good at explaining the causes of today's crisis. I mean, people have tried for centuries to describe the cause of the Roman collapse. And what you get out of it is that those people, those synthetic historians, were correct, but that everybody's got their little bias that they want to go. So they emphasize one property of the reason for these collapses instead of the set of properties, and explain how their bias fits into that set of properties that cause these collapses. So first thing is you have the Middle East and India, which is the real Fertile Crescent goes all the way over to the Indus River Valley, right? I mean, it really goes. When we talk about it as the Fertile Crescent, which is the Nile through the coastal area, through the Tigris Euphrates to the Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf, but the next arc of that is over into which is by sea, very close to the Persian Gulf, which is the Indus River. And we take it even farther across to that, and we go into the rivers, China's primary rivers. What's the right name for the river systems there?
It's Huanghe and Changjiang. Huanghe means yellow river, literally. Changjiang means a long river. They also call it Yangtze River, but I think Yangtze is maybe more ancient name or something.
Yes. And so these regions have seasonal weather patterns or seasonal flood patterns. Well, and both of them have seasonal flood patterns, but they also have seasonal weather patterns. So you have some that are runoff, melt runoff, and some that are melt runoff, and some that are typhoon, and some which is hurricane, and some that are the combination of both, right? You have Himalayan, where's it melting in the head of the Nile? The mouth, fuck.
I don't know that part of the world.
I can't remember
Geometry.
the guys that are about to go to war over it. Anyway, sorry, I feel like an idiot. I can't.
Oh, you're talking about like are you still talking about the Himalayas? Or are you talking about down the Nile?
I was going to bop around, but because I was trying to hit the melt off regions. So you have like the Himalayas, right? Or Himalayan runoffs, which is huge, right? I mean, you have the origin of the Nile, which is fuck. Anyway,
Look it up.
Is it Ethiopia? What's the origin of the Nile? Can you look that up for me?
Yeah.
And then you have the origin in the Caspian and that mountain region. What's that mountain region called?
So the White Nile, which is longer of the two, begins at Lake Victoria in Tanzania.
Yeah, but the northern one. It's the northern one.
The Blue Nile begins near Lake Tana in Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, so it is Ethiopia. Okay, so so you have those meltwater regions, which cause seasonal flooding. In the Tigris Euphrates, you have meltwater regions. In those regions, you have pretty standard fare in the Eastern Mediterranean coast, except that it's a very shallow green area followed by a vast fucking desert. And you have the same thing happen with the Indus River Valley, and you have the same thing happening in the yellow and the
the Long River.
Sorry?
So the Yellow River and Long River in China, actually, their origination is very close. I've been to some mountain range up in the Himalayas that separated the two. It's pretty amazing, right? Like on one side of the mountain, that's all Yellow River. Then on the other side, it's all Long River, but they all melt from the Himalayas.
What Americans call the I want to keep one as the Ganges, and that's India. What's the other one? Yellow River and the
Long River?
Yeah, but what does the Americans call it?
Yangtze River.
Say again?
Yangtze River.
Yeah, thank you.
That's American pronunciation. Yangtze, it's the Mandarin pronunciation.
So you have these river systems that are flowing. In Europe, you don't really have that. You have a fairly temperate climate, but there's no, and there are seasonal rivers, but you don't have this ability to produce this warm weather flood pattern that allows for the continuous accumulation of silts that builds up increasingly fertile land. And so Europe doesn't get that, and and so Europe is also somewhat far away. Now Africa is really far away, so they get none of it. They get none of this. And Africa's rivers are terrible, right? They go the wrong fucking direction, and they're not big enough, and etc. Um, so you get this complex complex environmental issue, so that when you get droughts or the normal things that happen, which is you get warm periods and cold periods, you get a prolonged period at the time of drought, which causes migration because they have to. The second weird thing is that around the same time, which if you're a history of a student of the history of art like I am, you're aware how many fucking earthquakes are happening in the Mediterranean at this time, right? And the third is that these are not countries that we're talking about. The world is made of city states, right? Right. And they're built on what's called palace economies. So if you think of feudalism as a manor, like a castle or a big manor house or something, and they've got a certain amount of land they control, and they have serfs on them, whatever. That's a little micro economy. It's not a state yet, right? Right. It's not like a state that can control its borders and all the way out there with long reach and administrative processes, right? It's quite simple. So Crete is the well-known example, but so I tend to know that one, and it's also vaguely European because it is populated by Greeks. So if you're on Crete, you've had fucking catastrophes after catastrophe, right? And so you've had these climatological changes. You've had these earthquakes and shit that give rise to the Atlantis myth and all this other crap going on, right? And then you have these palace economies that are more like feudal manors, right? Around these different. Some of these palace economies are big. I mean, they're pretty profound. Some of them are walled, like in the Middle East, because you have the constant threat. The thing that's interesting about Crete is that they don't have walls because the sea is their wall, right? And their navy is their barrier against conquest. And so like you've got climatological change, migration because of it, and you've got palace economies. But that's important because these palace economies are only possible because the network of trade routes between them. In other words, no palace economy is large enough on its own to be sustainable without the trade that comes from other palace economies, any more than any feudal domain was capable of surviving without an alliances and trade with other feudal domains. And this is because these things are relatively small. Even if they say they have an empire from here to here, what they mean is we have captured all the palace economies in these territories, because the rest of it's just, wild men, so to speak, and poverty. And so what you've got is this incredibly complex network of trade that has evolved, and in particular, you have the problem of bronze, which requires copper and tin, of which, oddly enough, something we consider very cheap, tin, is quite rare and requires those trade routes to get.
Didn't like the Middle East get their tin from Britain or something in the Bronze Age?
Yeah, from Afghanistan, Britain, a couple other places. It's not like there are no deposits of it, but if you want to be a power projector and you want to have an empire that unites palace economies so that you can afford to preserve the trade routes, right, between these palace economies, that allows you as an individual palace survive, right? We think of this as an egoistic thing. It's not, right? These people are doing what they're doing for rational, practical reasons, even if like Ashur Nasirpal or Ashur Nasirbanipal write stupid shit in cuneiform about they have big dicks and they're whatever, right? So even if they write this heroic bullshit, the practical reality is you have palace economies strung together by trade, where the trade is necessary because you need the trade to produce at least the bronze to make the weapons to be able to fend those palaces from the constant threat of barbarians from everywhere and from the fact that even locals are problematic. All right. So the next thing is that you get the rise of iron technology instead of bronze. Now you can cut a bronze sword in half with an iron sword, right, without too much difficulty at all. And so you have the rise of bronze. So, for example, when the people of Europe who later migrate to the coast of Canaan, right in that area, those southern area around Israel, they bring with them European iron, and so that's why they're hated by the Israelis. Is the Israelis have no iron, and these European migrants who've landed on their shores have iron. So when you're hearing all these biblical stories, that's the underlying problem. They're weak compared to the relocated Europeans.
That's passage that Yahweh couldn't defeat the Hittites because they had chariots of iron.
Yes, well said. So Europeans now. So I'm trying to create this understanding this system, because the reason the Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe was because of system failure. Does that make sense? This is a system. You can only look at it as a system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a system between the Egypt, the coastal region, the Mesopotamians, the Indians, the Caucasians, the North Caucasians, and the Europeans. But who's got the iron? Europeans got iron. Right? And so the Indo-Europeans have iron. The Indo-Europeans have two things. They have an iron cult. They have a bronze, iron, wheel, horse, chariot, and they don't have this palace structure that is dependent upon ruling vast numbers of people along the edges of rivers to concentrate wealth in a small number of hands that can then pay for these military campaigns. You have instead a bunch of essentially entrepreneurial clans or families that are professional warriors that either own lands and have conquered lands of others, that so you produce this alliance, and you have a political system that's based on trust rather than fear. And so what occurs is that this pressure because of climate, think of it as, I don't know which direction is which here, but you're spreading out, the crisis in Central Asia spreads out, right, and causes migrations. The same thing happens in Europe, where you have the core of Europe actually develop up in Poland and Germany, right, in that area, and it starts to move down, right? So you move downward, right? And so you get the Greek movement around both directions of the Black Sea. Greek movement this way, the Hittite movement this way. You get the down flood of others to the north, which is what I guess the Greeks referred to, or Alexander's people, the Macedonians, right? You get the same effect in Italy, and you get the same effect either further westward towards Spain. And so what's happening is there's this downward pressure. And these people who are naturally cattle raiders on the steppe, who have become conquerors, merged with the farmers in Europe, have maintained this aristocratic high trust structure of basically militarizing every fucking person in the polity, and arming every fucking person in the polity, not just with bronze, but also they still had stone, right? Stone axes and shit, right? But they had bronze weapon, and they had iron weapon, and they had some of them had iron chariots. And then, so what happened is that downward pressure caused disruption in this palace economy, which caused these people to look at the East as targets. And so these people move in, and they gradually come across, and the sea peoples, they get together and they go raid these places and in doing so, they break the system economy, right? And because it's a unification of so many groups, right, with slightly superior social, political, and technological structures, they come in and break this relatively fragile palace economy, similar to how it's no more complicated than how the Mongols, with their slightly superior use of horses and bows and raiding, destroyed the network of the later early state formations that were happening across Eurasia, right? It's the same fucking process. It just requires you have a mobile strategy rather than a fixed one. And once you convert from production to raiding, raiding is so rewarding that you keep going until you run out of people to raid, which
Mongols eventually did. Well, I think in Europe they stopped. Actually, why did the Mongols stop in Europe?
Well, the literature is they stopped because the Khan.
The Khan passed away, so they turned to infighting. So basically, Genghis Khan passed away. He was the uniting force of all the Mongol tribes, and as soon as he bit, they basically went into.
Which is the problem. It's the problem of the Middle East. Is the same problem with. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this right now in a micro environment in Syria. It's the same fucking problem. You got a bunch of raiders taking over a palace economy. It's destroyed the palace economy, and the problem is who's going to fucking pick up the pieces now? So what U.S. and Israel are doing is going and destroying every military asset they have and find. They have the only thing they can do is fix home and rebuild a productive economy instead of a raider economy. But that's why even Islam was successful. It was successful as a raiding structure, right, until it ran out of places to raid, which was raised basically Spain. Right? They couldn't defeat Europe on the eastern side at the time because the Constantinople coordinate of the old Roman Empire was still too powerful. But they were able to make it down into Spain and hold it for a while. So raiders are great if you have some trade system to exploit. So the early civilizations had the river systems to exploit. The later systems had basically what we think of as the Silk Road network to exploit. And today, what they have, the Middle East has, is they have the more advanced civilizations and their trade to exploit, specifically because of their ability to the oil on their territory. And so it's the same process throughout all of history that's going on. There's nothing particularly interesting about it other than to make capital, you have to stay fixed, and if you can't make capital, that becomes a bait for you to raid, which destroys the capital and the networks or the trade networks which make the capital concentration possible. You reduce everything down until there's nothing left to raid, and everybody has to go back to building up again in this vicious fucking cycle of nonsense. Which is again why I say I don't think it's immoral that the West is trying to domesticate the rest of the world into nation states and trade networks, because once there's nobody left who's better off raiding, right? Then there's less risk of anybody getting raiders, and more likely that
what you're saying is the West has been trying to reduce and eliminate the incentive for defect in the prisoner's dilemma game.
Correct. Well, that was a really smart way of saying it. Yes.
That's what West might claim to be doing. That's not what we have been doing at all, actually.
All right, so
let's go down this tangent.
I won't have this
because
argument.
it'll take another hour.
All right, so the reason the Bronze Age collapse happens is because raiding and plunder, raping, pillaging. I got to do it in order. Raping, pillaging, plundering, and raping is a really good strategy if there's capital to raid. In other words, hunting and gathering is a good thing until you run out of things to hunt and gather. It's the same fucking principle.
Well,
right?
Because the habitat have a certain carrying capacity.
Correct. And
for this matter, for this manner of well, for this method, right? Just like the North American continent was only able to support so many Native American Indians because of their method, and then once you convert that habitat to farming, it was able to support far more
Correct.
populace. I was
So
explaining
this
to my
is
daughter about this the other day, that we humans are one of the only species, maybe the only species, that's capable of converting the habitat to something of that we can thrive in.
correct. And so if you get this picture, not only is the Bronze Age collapse rational, but basically all of human history is rational. The whole goal from this perspective is to eliminate the any group who depends on rating rather than self-sufficiency. And so, I mean, what is the natural law, right? I mean, it's not only to not offend those people that are engaging in self-determination by self-determined means, but it is to fend your ability to maintain self-determination by self-determined means by depriving others of their ability to obtain self-determination not by self-determined means, in other words, not by productivity, which is just evolution doing its thing. So I don't know. I thought that was a pretty good discussion, right? I mean, it's just systems failure, which is how it's talked about in the literature.
If you mean self-determination by productivity, then you should say that. Because I would say if they determine to write, then that is their self-determination.
Yeah, but it's not self-determination by self-determined means, right?
Isn't it?
Well, it's just going back to hunter-gatherer. It's the same thing as converting from farming back to hunter-gatherer. It's the same issue. The problem is you run out of things to gather, hunt and gather.
Yeah, but those are your self-determined means. They may be unsustainable, but that is what you've determined yourself to do.
Right, but again, you don't get to determine. You don't have the choice of choosing your own morality. You have only the choice of choosing the morality that will survive, that you can survive in. And so the history is not favorable to the people you're talking about. It's decidedly unfavorable to the raiders. The raiders may destroy for temporary profit, but they always end up with discord and incapability of rule, such that the result is that the resurgent producers eventually defeat them. The only reason the West could ever defeat the East is specifically because of their political and economic strategy, which was to use everybody possible to advance technology such that the smaller numbers could not be defeated by the larger numbers of the East.
Basically saying self-determined means and survivable means are not necessarily the same.
Same thing, correct.
So what you're asking for is self-determination by survivable means.
Yes, and what I think you're pointing out is that I say the long-term survival means, in other words, the criteria for decidability, independent of context, is going to be what is self-determination by self-determined means. But if you want to say, I can, like all cognition, you can violate the natural law, the laws of nature, if it gets you a temporary gain, sure, at the cost of the subsequent consequences. So if you are going to, if you're only concerned about short-term consequences, then and you want to leave the future to someone else, then you can take those things that deviate from what I would call the laws of nature, the natural law. You'll just pay the consequence for it. And there's no contrary case in history, so I don't know what, there's just no contrary condition of that. Matter of fact, the argument would be the only way to win is to stay ahead. Anyway, and staying ahead is the only achieved through the means which I'm advocating. It's not you can catch up by right-wing authoritarian methods. You can't stay ahead by those methods because the very act of the authority suppresses the innovation and experimentation, innovation and disruption that makes possible staying ahead. So there's no way
Yeah,
to get around it.
that's a story of China.
What?
That's a story of China,
Yes.
starting with about the Song Dynasty. From whatever little I read about Chinese history, Tang Dynasty, that was basically the peak,
Yeah.
where there's lots of experimentation and even incorporating foreigners in order to outcompete and so on. But then the I don't know what it's called in English, the Anshi Rebellion,
Hmm.
and then that essentially destroyed that empire, made them distrust any outsiders. And then
Yes.
what following the Tang Dynasty was the period of just constant warfare, constant state failures of smaller states, and so on. It was a huge chaos. So
Correct.
by the time we got to the Song Dynasty, the Chinese ruling elite figured out, well, we actually have to have centralized power, and even at the cost of innovation. Of course, they didn't state in those terms. And
You have to get to where the European nobility did,
mhm,
which is that as long as we maintain military power, right, right, military power and the power to tax, whatever the fucking middle class wants to do that makes us money is okay, right? You have to get to that point, and the problem is the that emerging middle class has to be uh, has to has to feel as if the government that they're working under is not hostile to what they're doing, right? And so this is one of those things where I get on this rant of oneness. We have to do everything the same versus there are class there. It's like a military. There are ranks, and ranks have
mhm,
responsibilities. And as long as everybody in their rank does their responsibilities, it doesn't matter what they do,
mhm,
right? As long as they do their responsibilities. And the problem is you have to develop trust to do that.
right,
India is interesting how they did it. Kind of weird to me, but they did it. Um, uh, China did it at the upper levels, but not at the lower levels. And Europeans did it originally at the upper levels, and then tried to indoctrinate the lower levels. And that seems to have tried to work pretty well. So in any event, I think we've got this one down.
yeah.
Have we got that was another good one.
Okay, we got time for, or I got time for one more because I got to go in about 20 minutes. So question 3.
Wait a minute. You make me talk for fucking for an hour and a half before you get to a question that Martin gets to do. How is that fair?
I,
Nobody made it.
I don't order them. I don't have control over the order of the questions. Okay, finally.
Martin, your
Pardon me.
job is to order these, so I don't have to talk for a fucking hour and a half.
No, we do them in a queue. The only question that I know of that, well, there are very few exceptions. Like this one went out of queue because didn't want to answer it last week. Okay. Question 3. Many try to analyze the behavior of the Jews through the lens of their scriptures and prophecies, but how can we have a better understanding of their way of operating when there are so many powerful Jews that are secular and don't care about religious traditions?
Well, it's a misunderstanding. Many of those traditions persist, and the strategy itself remains nearly identical. Justifications have indeed changed to secular, but underneath they're still operating the same way as if they were fulfilling the covenant with their psychopathic god Yahweh to enslave or destroy all the other nations in the world. It would be just as naive to claim whites are no longer Christian. We still act as if we are, for better or worse, except we've now gotten rid of all the base aspects of Christianity inherited from paganism.
You know what? Psychopathic. That's the first time I heard someone use that word to describe Yahweh. And it's actually pretty succinct to the chagrin of all the
It's
Christians out there.
true.
When you said that, and when you read that, I thought, hey, what I can actually do is feed the AI the Old Testament and have it do a psychological analysis on Yahweh.
Isn't it a bit too much text for the current AI?
You just have
It's
to
not
do it.
that long.
You have to do it as a sequence.
It's pretty long.
Right? I'm going to do this. I'm going to post a bunch of sequences so that it knows it maintains context. You could get it. You could get through there. Now they tell me that the next context window for GPT-5 is going to be 1 million tokens. If that's true, then we're in good shape.
Where do they get all the computation power? But anyways, back to this question.
Microsoft knows what they're doing. I mean, I got to tell you, I mean, Bill was good. Ballmer was a catastrophe, but Satya's doing a pretty good job. I'm kind of impressed, really.
Okay, so not to distract from this one, because otherwise we're not going to be able to finish. Curt, do you have anything to add?
I think, of course, Martin's correct as usual. In other words, a group strategy is persistent regardless of the formality of its method of transmission. This is why you'll find out in studying what is the book about the 4 waves of immigrants into America from Britain, or you'll find out in Manuel Todd's work that the ethics, the morals of a given family remain a reflection of whatever crop their ancestors farmed in the medieval era. And this is fascinating, but true, and it shows that morality is basically conveyed. Morality and group strategy are conveyed by family, tribe, and ethnicity, family, clan, tribe, and ethnicity, through environmental exposure and behavioral correction or behavioral encouragement or correction, and not through how it's expressed. Mythologies help if you want during the process of education, but the group strategies, at least at the family level, can persist for centuries. I would say that Martin's correct with this. I would say my work has said that as the Ashkenazi, or the Jews in Ashkenazi, maybe even the entirety of the Middle East, operates by the feminine group evolutionary strategy. In other words, it's what we call the European master versus Semitic slave morality. And that's basically restated as the masculine European and the Middle Eastern feminine strategy. And so they use a low trust, highly seditious means of warfare, and the Jewish use a low trust, highly seditious means of competition. It's not to say that's just the advantage. They've practiced upward redistribution of reproduction for a long time, and it's been incredibly effective at producing verbal fluency. Even the interesting thing, of course, is that it has not produced masculine spatial temporal fluency and so skills. So you end up with a very verbal, pictorial, emotional, seductive, seditious strategy, which happens to be incredibly effective when applied to anything to do with money, because money is amoral and impersonal, while the masculine method of strategy, which basically requires insurance, in other words, loyalty, requires makes you personal, and it makes it personal and liable. And so the Jewish strategy happens to work extremely effective with the financialization, which facilitates baiting into hazard. And it is the polar opposite of the European masculine strategy, which is one of alliances, intertemporal alliances, built on trust for the long-term production and preservation of capital. So, if what I'm going to make a funny here, I'm not really serious. So, just as women are psychopathic, so is Yahweh is obviously psychopathic, and of course the Jewish strategy is psychopathic on our terms. But it happens to be practical if you're weak. are you're weak and you lack spatial temporal skills, so you're weak in innovation, other than innovation in the application of verbal acuity and seduction and sedition. So I would say that Martin is right at the first level of depth, which is the cultural level. And I'm saying that it's not only cultural, it's become genetic at this point and institutional. And institutional. And so you get this Jewish behavior even over generations. I find it somewhat interesting with my Jewish friends who are genetically Jewish, but they have been brought up and favor the European way. They still understand the Jewish way, and they'll even say, that's the Jew in me coming out, right? Because they see these seductive, seditious, irreciprocal opportunities that women sees, that women would normally seize, but they resist them simply because they're aware of them. Of course, my objective would be to make that was the universal way Jews looked at the problem, just as it was the universal way women looked at the problem. If we're unsuccessful in that, European men simply have to, what's it called? We have to nationalize the institutions on one hand, and then we may have to, what's the equivalent of sexually monopolize the institutions as well? I would prefer not to do that. I would prefer to train the behavior of people rather than resort to nationalism and ethnic monopoly and sexual monopoly of institutions. But I think that is based, as Martin would say, on my Anglo optimism versus his continental pessimism.
It's we are trying to turn women into men, which is harmful to both sexes.
Correct. And so this is the case where I'm stating what I think is the nice version because I want people to have the choice. I'm not done telling you you're right yet. And Martin is jumping to saying, yeah, well, fuck that. Let's not pay that cost. Let's just realize that it's not good for us to do that. And so we shouldn't, we need to take the pessimistic understanding. So Martin, I was saying you were right. Okay. Is that okay? Was that okay? Now you get to say.
Just saying that doing these social engineering projects based on some utopian narrative isn't actually nice towards anyone.
Right. So I know why I have this. Can I tell you why I have this? Is because I'm very conscious of the naturalistic fallacy. And so unlike the left, who says the naturalistic fallacy means humans are infinitely adaptable. In other words, they have blank slates and they're all equal. I say, no, humans are not infinitely adaptable, nor are they blank slates. In fact, it takes quite a bit of work to get them to understand the world as it is so that they can act rationally in the context of it. And what you're saying is, Curt, that's a very elitist, optimistic view of that's an upper middle class or upper class view of what's possible for people. And the reality is that it isn't possible, and it's only harmful to people to even try. And I'm left with my job, which I think this is one of the core differences between your position and mine, is I'm left with the statement that I can't make a truth claim about that. I can only give people the choice and leave them the choice to them. And I think you're saying more for Europeans, we need to make this choice correctly because we've already tried everything else and it doesn't work. I think those are just two differences in our perceived roles and responsibilities. And so I that's why I keep saying Martin's probably right. You know, when we disagree, Martin's probably right. But I have a different job than Martin does, and I'm conscious of my job. So is that okay, Martin? I just said you were right.
That's okay. I'll take it.
It's the same thing with the Institute. I don't want the Institute. I want the institute to provide the science and tell people the costs and trade-offs so they make choices. What I don't want to do, which I think that Martin and nearly all of the conservative West would like me to do, is say we need to do this. That would be in my terms violating my role.
You want to maintain a value neutral stance, just like the science, the language.
Yep. If you want to do something and you don't understand the trade-off you're making, fine, pay the fucking price. But my job is to give the people the truth and what's the cause and consequences and what are the field of potentials so that they can choose wisely or not. And frankly, that means the people who choose wisely will be in a better condition than the people who don't. And I think that it would be wonderful if the West would choose Martin's. I would rather it couched in my terms, but that Martin is correct. We would be better off with some sort of ethno capture of state. I'm still not sure on that one because I come back to you can test for what we do, right? You can test the personality for what we do. In other words, regardless of origin. But if you're fully integrated into this model, I don't see the problem. The problem is when you're not fully integrated into this European model. In the absence of that, I would say that ethno-nationalize the state and within the ethno-nationalization, sexually monopolize the state so that we just don't have this problem. We can always get men to behave correctly because we can purge the left-leaning ones and keep the right-leaning ones. But even then, it seems to be a pretty good advantage to keep some left-leaning men in there so they have a voice because they're the minority, right? Let them have their voice so that we understand the opposite side's perspective. I mean, if men are arguing for what's good for women and children and minorities, I want to hear that voice, but I want to hear it in rational European terms. And so I don't have this arrogance of that my current understanding is eternal. I just want to hear the argument so that we can decide. But that's again my view of my place. All right, that's it.
All right, we've got only 5 minutes left. Shall we wrap it up?
Oh, it's too bad. I'd really like to Martin to talk about this one.
Oh, number 4.
Yeah.
Martin, do you have anything to add to number 3?
I don't think so.
Sorry, say again.
I don't think so.
Can I add one thing? Is that when I say that this all the time, when you have the Greeks and the Romans, why the fuck would you look at the Bible or the Jews or the Muslims at all? Why would you even consider that? What?
To understand the enemy.
To understand the enemy. But it's not to look for wisdom in it. It's fucking evil. And but the problem is when people are brought up in a religious context, that's the lens that they want to view the world through. They're not looking at it through the lenses we say, which are this basically scientific lenses. And it really bothers me. These questions always bother me because they're like, why do you think what's in the religion matters? What's in the group strategy? How do they apply it? Is it reciprocal or not? And that's all there is to it. I mean, we've been at conflict with the Middle East forever. We still are in conflict with them. They're a fucking cancer, not only for us, but for Indian civilization, African civilization, and Chinese civilization. They're a fucking cancer. So why do we even study them other than to say, it doesn't matter what their books say. It matters what they do. It's the same thing with any philosophy or any theology or any claim. it doesn't matter what the justification used means. It matters what the behavior that they're demonstrating means. And so I just don't understand why we even look at it. We have, I mean, the Greeks in 500 ABC are writing all this fucking genius, and what are the Jews doing in 500 BC or the Arabs? They're doing fucking monkey level stuff, superstitious nonsense. And so I just don't understand why we do that. Why would you not at least look at China, where at this they're producing.
Well, according to the Collins, even China during that period is mud hut people.
Well, but that's okay. But I mean, if you're going to look at Confucius and Lao Tzu and
Sun
yeah,
Tzu,
Sun
Tzu.
Sun Tzu and the bunch of other.
right. I mean, if you're going to look at least look at them, right? If you want to maintain if you don't want to disconnect, like in other words, disconnect fields like the West disconnects responsibility by class as if it's a military structure, at least look at China and do the intermix, right? Of trying to maintain the family in the context of the polity. At least look at that. But why would you look at the most fuck up people in the world who have the most conflict in the world for anything other than how do we put a fucking wall around you and stop you cancerous fuckers from polluting the rest of the civilizations? I mean, I can't even understand why you even think about it. And so this is my problem with this, again, the openness of Western civilization is like where we got so luxurious and confident in our successes that we took, well, we'll just look at everybody on equal terms. Bullshit. I mean, there are definite differences in how these societies function. But the truth is, which of them are bad? There's only one. All the rest are fine. I mean, you can bitch about Africa being disorganized, but I mean, it's not like it's
They
evil.
did the best they could,
right?
Given the circumstances and the horrible place that they live on.
For all intents and purposes, wild animals, they're not a threat.
Well, yeah, but even you give them Christianity, look what happens. Mm-hmm. It's kind of surprising to me. But I mean, if you look at if it weren't for the CCP, China had it up to take over the fucking planet.
And remember, CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, again, that's a Jewish ideology. It's foreign to China. Yes.
Whereas if you'd just let the what was going on under Deng continue, the Chinese could have taken over the world, and we would have liked it. Right? I mean, it was just, okay, well, they're making our world cheap for us. That's great. We're trading like hell with them. But the minute you start threatening your neighbors because you want your ideology to continue, what the fuck? That's just the Jewish Muslim expression of religious conversion by the pretense that your secular claims aren't a religion. Anyway.
All right, gentlemen, I gotta run.
Thank you today. This is Friday, December 13th, 2024. This is Francis Stepan and Martin Stepan and Francies Zhou, Martin Stepan, and Curt Doolittle for the Natural Law Institute. This has been our Q&A session, and we only got through 3 fucking questions. Is that all we got through?
Yeah, all right. Next time I got to keep the time better and not distract you myself.
I don't know, dude. Those are great conversations. I would have to say that they're great.
We got another one on the 20th next Friday. I guess we're gonna keep on going on this weekly schedule until we work through.
There's a lot here.
I think it's going to be forever now.
We're gonna be here forever.
All right. I love you guys. Thank you very much, and for all the audience, thank you so much. Look in the comments below for how to leave a question for us, and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.